Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the What's in My Head podcast. Today, I'm joined by a Miss Linda Simensky. You will know the name, but you will also know the shows that she's worked on. Just to rattle off a few, we've got Rocko's Modern Life, Samurai Jack, the Powerpuff Girls, Dexter's Lab, of course, Eddy and Eddy. It came up 15 different times at this point with your name, and I'm so happy to have you here, Miss Linda. Thank you for doing this. How are you?
I'm good, Julian. How are you?
Fantastic. I always ask that question before and right when we hit the record button. It always seems weird because it's a loaded question because I already asked you that. But nonetheless, man, we're here and we're going to have some fun. For the viewers, this lady played such a huge role in not only mine, yours, and everybody else's to come, and my son's that's coming up, his role as well, because we were such, and by we, I fell into the show after the fact, but Dinosaur Train played nonstop in my house.
Great.
Nonstop with my son. He absolutely loved. I can't think of any of the characters' names because I was so burnt out at that point. But we had the talking dinosaurs where we'd put on and they would talk to each other and they would walk away, and when they came back, they would talk to each other again. He absolutely loved that show. So that was his first experience as far as shows that you were a part of. And since then, I have introduced him to some of the other shows, and he does not want anything to do with anything like Eddy and Eddy. Dexter's Lab is one thing because he's a redhead like myself, so he's like, oh, I can associate with him. So
how old is your son?
He just turned 11.
Oh, okay, that's cool.
Yeah, so I'm trying to introduce him to everything that is good in this world, and everything that is good is stuff that you teach at the University of Penn, and it's animation. So we're going to talk strictly animation today. We might have some other stuff come up, but it's just going to depend on how well this conversation goes and how loose we can get here, Miss Linda. So how I open it up always is not so much how you got into animation, but when did you start looking at animation as far as, or do you still look at animation? I don't want to assume that I know what you're thinking in your head right now, but when did you start looking at animation more than just a cartoon and you started looking at it as like, oh shit, I can make this into a profession?
Okay, this is going to sound like a strange thing, but I was probably about 6,
Okay.
and I was watching the Flintstones, and it was that moment where I think everyone has this moment where they're watching the Flintstones, if they watched the Flintstones growing up, where they noticed that Fred and Barney ran past the same thing 3 times. And I had that moment of, how does that work? Why did they run past the same thing 3 times? And that became like something I needed to figure out. And I started like trying to understand how animation was made, not by reading a book about it. I don't think there were any books written about how animation was made at that point, or like the impact of animation. There was nothing like that. That sort of, that world of the impact of television, it hadn't been figured out yet. So I was really just watching it and just trying to figure out, how was this made? I could see at age 6, these weren't humans. They were something else. It wasn't real. It wasn't live action. But what was it, and how was it made? And I remember trying to figure it out. And that tip off that they ran past the same background 3 times made me think somebody was lazy while they were making this. and so this is me at age 6, like obsessed with how cartoons are made. And I was also a huge fan of Bugs Bunny. And I watched a lot of Bugs Bunny cartoons, and I was very interested in why they didn't all look the same. Like, why did Bugs Bunny look, weird in different ones? And why did, like I didn't understand that they were made over, a few decades. But I couldn't figure out why, why was that they did that? And I also didn't realize they had been made years ago. I thought they were, just like they made one every now and then, and we would just watch them. And, I'd see them in movie theaters. So I got very interested in, like, what is all this? And how does it come to be? And who's making them? And how do they get made? And then I discovered Peanuts and spent a lot of time trying to draw Charlie Brown. And that was more a comic strip than animation. But like, that was my world. I learned to read so that I could read the comics and the TV section. And that was my motivation for learning to read. And so, that was like, it was something I was very interested in, but this was a long time ago. And so it seemed pretty weird to people, like people were not really into cartoons after age 8. and girls were definitely not into cartoons after age 8. So I must have seemed pretty weird to a lot of people, but I was pretty obsessed with cartoon. Like the older I got, the more fascinated I got with them. And I remember at like age 13 or so, you start to get to that point where you have to commit to like, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I thought about it for a long time, and then I said, no, I want to write for Bugs Bunny.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember my mom said, I don't know if it's in production anymore, but well, that's good. You could do that. And she just kind of encouraged me to do that. And I always thought that was good. Now that I look back at that, she never said, oh no, you can't do that. Or, she just, like, if something came on TV that was animated, she'd call me and she'd say, look at this, it's animated. And we'd watch it. And, sometimes it was just a short or a commercial or something, but she was very supportive. And so that helped, because the timing of all of this is particularly significant, because the point that I got to college was 1981.
Mm-hmm.
So if you know anything about animation history, this is kind of the low point of animation. The 80s. And now there are people who grew up in the 80s who think this is not true, but in my opinion, the 80s were really not a great time for animation, but definitely not a great time for feature animation. And so, Disney was making, what were they making? Black Cauldron.
Yeah.
And that came out in like, I guess 85 or so. And so not a good time for TV animation, not a good time for feature animation, a pretty good time for independent animation. And that was something that I saw when I was in college, and that blew my mind. And that was the moment where I came out of the show. It was one of those like 2-hour screenings of a bunch of shorts. And I said, okay, I want to work in an industry that is somehow connected to bringing those kinds of shorts, that kind of animation, to people. Because if people could see this kind of animation, they'd want more of it. Then people would be really into it, because this is all so cool. And this to me was like, okay, if you stopped watching animation when you were 8 because there was really nothing good to watch, and the only thing you wanted to watch after that was like the Flintstones and Bugs Bunny, if you saw these kinds of shorts, you'd want to watch these. And so it was in my head, I should work in something related to these independent shorts. And so that was the first moment of me starting to think, okay, it's like, maybe I won't be writing for Bugs Bunny because it's not in production anymore, but I could do something with this, because these were all made in the past year or two. So I could do something with this. And from there, I just felt like, okay, so if I'm going to work in this area, I need to see every animated film ever made. Now, this is before people had VCRs and tapes of animation, and so if I like saw that like the library was screening a short before a movie theater, I'd go in, watch the short, leave if I didn't feel like watching the movie. I was like, I'd scour the screenings to see if there were going to be short films before movies. I was really interested in that, and so I tracked all these things. And, I started to understand there were a lot of animated shorts, so I was never going to get to see them all, but I was like working my way through them, and I was very industrious about it. And that's kind of how I started thinking of animation as maybe something I would really get to do when I grew up, and not just something I enjoyed watching. And then, my jobs, I was able to find some animation connection in some of the very early jobs. Like I worked in, I had some summer jobs. I worked at Viking Junior Books when I was going into my sophomore year of college. And that was really cool, because I really liked publishing. But, I was like, no, I'm just going to keep focusing on animation. And then I worked at Warner Brothers the next year. It was okay, but, they weren't doing anything particularly interesting from my point of view. So, it helped me realize I didn't want to work in features, but it wasn't like they weren't doing a lot. it was the summer that National Lampoon's Vacation came out. So that's the one thing I remember from that summer. But the cool thing about working there was that I was able to meet people so that I could get a summer job the next year at Nickelodeon.
Mhm.
And so I was working for a producer at Nickelodeon. Nick had maybe 20 people working there. You know, it was very small at that point. That was the summer of '84. And that was when I thought, okay, this is cool. I want to work here when I get out of school. And I bet they're going to do animation someday. And I'm going to be ready for that. So I was spending a lot of time trying to learn as much as I could about animation that whole time. And I would be in college and I'd be sitting in the library trying to get through a reading. I was majoring in communications, and so I'd have all these behavioral communications articles. They were pretty boring. So I'd go over to the little tiny shelf that was half full, and it had like 6 or 7 books about animation and a bunch of issues of Funny World. And I had that moment of, oh, okay, so there are other people who like this stuff. And I read through all those books and I looked through all the Funny Worlds, and I got to, I got to learn a few things through doing that. But that was it. I couldn't find any more books about animation. And so that was kind of the extent of my learning. There were no classes on the history of it or anything like that. But like I would write papers, why do people watch Bugs Bunny reruns? I would ask those questions and do the research to figure out why and things like that. So I was sort of cobbling together what I could to kind of learn in advance of a career that technically didn't really exist yet. Not what I was imagining. I didn't really want to go work for Hanna-Barbera or Disney or anything like that. So I didn't really know what I was preparing for until I worked at Nick. And then I thought, this is where I want to work. So that's how it all came together for me. It was a little bit of an experiment. It was a little bit of me just, following my interests and my passion without really knowing exactly how it was going to end up. But that's pretty much how it all came together.
So there's a couple things that I want to circle back. Your mother sounds like an amazing woman. I mean,
She
just
was, yes.
just the fact that because you said something that I don't think enough people would have caught and really expound upon, and it's the fact that you said once you turned 8, you kind of got looked at differently. And we talked briefly about Mr. Beck. Jerry Beck was on last night, and he said the same concept. He's like, once you get to a certain age, they look at you funny if you're like, we showed each other our comic book collection and everything like that. We got real nerdy last night. But like once you get to a certain age, you get looked at differently because you shouldn't be reading that because it's a kid's book, or you shouldn't be watching that because it's made for kids. And Jerry was very adamant when he was talking about, Bugs Bunny and Daffy and all these cool cartoons back in the day. He's like, these things weren't made for kids. And he was, kids watch them now. These were not made for kids. And I never thought about that to an extent until he really said it. I was like, well, shit, Jerry, you're an expert here. And I'm like, I never in my 30, I'll be 32 in August. In my 32 years of life, I've been watching cartoons for at least 28 of those years, right? I never thought that, like, man, the cartoons that I grew up on, with the exception of the cartoon boom at the end, mid 90s, really. I mean, you got the early 90s and stuff with Rocko and Rugrats and all that other stuff, and that kind of led to the explosion of what Fred and his team and everybody, all the great creators did with What a Cartoon and Cartoon, all these just huge initiatives that they did over at Cartoon Network and Hanna-Barbera Studios. It kind of cascaded. I'm like, God damn it. I mean, just to sit there and see somebody else's opinion, right? And you think about it, you're like, wow, these were not made for kids, yet we're having kids watch them. And then when parents go and watch these now, that's why you see, and he brought it up as well, all these cancellations of these characters, like Pepe Le Pew's a real big one. Like, we can't trust him. But everybody, and I mentioned this last night, like everybody knows somebody that's a Pepe Le Pew. Everybody knows somebody that's a Daffy Duck. Everybody knows a Bug. So it's very weird that we're canceling these characters. We're canceling these things that weren't intended for kids to begin with. But yet we're kind of, this might be, I've gotten comments on this one that I say I have an axe to grind with the younger generation, which I really don't, but it's like we're coddling, I guess, to an extent with some of these cartoons that like we just talked about. They weren't made for kids. But nonetheless, I digress. I want to get back to my original point was not only was your mother a great lady, it sounds like, and very, very influential and just pushing you into the path that you didn't know you would end up on. You were laying the foundation essentially for what was to come, right? Laying brick by brick at a time. And at 8 years old, you're getting looked at weird. And one point I really wanted to circle back to was that you're female, right? So obviously, whenever I would look at these credits, and I'm very new to looking deeper than just what I'm watching, right? So I've been looking, I want to know more and more and more about all these people. That's why I have you on. I want to know more about you and how you got to the role you're at and doing everything you're doing. And then everywhere you went, I mean, you might not think of it this way, but when I look at your resume, everything you worked on was a hit after hit after hit after hit after hit, right? It's fantastic and very rare. Do you see this? And even rare, I mean, even rare is, I don't remember seeing very many female names in this. And I don't want to be, that guy and say, oh, we gotta highlight the fact that you're a female. This is a very, very big thing, ladies and gentlemen. It's not just the fact that, she was on shows that I mentioned in the beginning. It's the fact that it's a pretty well documented that it's a very, very male oriented profession, is it not?
Oh, that's completely true. Although, and one of the things that I do want to point out, like for me and Jerry, it was also timing. Mm-hmm. We were enjoying cartoons past the point where we were supposed to, during a time where like kids showed that they were growing up by not watching kids shows anymore. And so like now, if you continued to watch Cartoon Network all the way through adulthood, no one would really question that.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe someone would, but that would be an evil
You don't need
person.
those people in your life.
But it was a much bigger deal back in like the 70s or the 80s to, early 80s, at that point, it was seen as kind of a weird thing, but I didn't really care. I liked it. So, I was sort of, I was just sort of like I was into it like beyond the point where it was casual and people understood that about me. Yeah. So like, I wasn't, I wasn't worried about that. And, if people had issues with it, I didn't really care. And so like, it didn't have any effect on me, but, people would think it was funny. Mm-hmm. I thought that was funny that they thought it was funny. And I was always trying to get people to come watch cartoons, which they usually would. So it really wasn't that big of a deal. I mean, I remember at one point in college, someone said, if you want to work in cartoons, why are you here? And I said, I'm developing my sense of humor. And we just left it at that. And no one ever asked me about it again. So that was that. But, when I got my jobs, people from college were all like, oh yeah, well, that makes sense. And, I was happy that all worked out. So that was good. But I think the thing about being a woman in the industry was a lot of women did work on the development side and a lot of women worked on the production side. So being a woman working on it, like in either of those areas, was not particularly notable because there were a lot of women who there weren't women creators and there weren't a lot of women directors or board artists. So those were the interesting ones. And when you meet people now who are like Yvette Kaplan, who, was directing, that was more unusual and actually less unusual in New York. It would have been more unusual in LA where there were so many more directors. But, like that sort of thing would have been odd. Me doing development, that didn't seem odd. And I was at Nick at that point, and Nick had a lot of women executives. So, nobody questioned it except for the guys in the studios, like, guys like John Kay were always like, oh, women, they're not funny. They don't laugh at anything. They don't get our jokes. They don't understand our sense of humor. So we had to put up with a lot of like, well, of course you won't understand this because you wouldn't understand why cheese is funny. And it's like, no, I don't. You're right. So we, we heard a lot of that, but, I think that was mostly designed to get us to say, well, if we don't know what's funny, just go ahead and make your cartoons and we won't bother you. But, I always felt like, I kind of know what's funny, I think, and I'm not sure you do.
Well,
So,
I just want to stop
so that was my attitude with some people. But so I'd say that was the odd thing, was really being an animation nerd or being an animation fanatic. That was a little more unusual, but
Mhm.
not completely unusual, because I got to the industry and there were some women in it, and a lot of people liked a lot of the same things, like things that I thought were just kind of odd. You'd walk through an animation studio and you'd see all these things up, and like I really liked Jim Flora. Jim Flora, the he drew a lot of weird jazz album covers
Okay.
back in the 50s and maybe the 60s. And so I went through my father's jazz collection one time, and I took all of the albums that had Jim Flora covers and I put them up on my wall. And I remember my father was like, "Did I say you could have those?" And I was like, no. But anyway, I really liked those, and to this day I still have some up, like in my office or around the house. And I remember walking through an animation studio and seeing at least 3 people with Jim Flora stuff tacked up on their walls, and I was like, okay, yeah, these are my people. And so I just kind of realized at that point, okay, this is a culture, and I didn't realize I was like preparing to be part of it. But a lot of the things I like are a lot of the things that everyone in this crowd likes. Like if you mentioned Peanuts in a random group of people would be like, "Hey, I read that as a kid." And you mentioned Peanuts in a group of animators, and everyone's like, "I could never draw Linus's head." And people would have that conversation. Or it's hard, Lucy's hair, things like that. And so that was, like, to me, that was the unusual thing, was being really into it. Like a lot of people got into animation because they liked Disney, or they just liked the idea of working in animation. But there were certain people who got into it because they were total fans. And so I would put myself in that category of just like a big nerd about it. And when I mean, big nerds, when people are really into something, that's that. They don't care what anybody thinks. So I don't really know what people were thinking. I did observe at age 8 that people didn't watch cartoons anymore, but I like it didn't really, I wasn't trying to prove anything. So I wasn't too worried. I wasn't trying to prove I was a grown up. I was scared of being a grown up. So
As you should be. There
yeah.
is nothing worse, and I want to see if I have it to run here. Oh, here it is. Hold on 1 second. I'm so glad you bring up the Peanuts, because I'm such a huge fan. And my wife actually got this last year for me for our anniversary.
Oh
Um,
yeah, that's a great book.
it's fantastic.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
going to sound like I'm not a fan right now, but I've actually got this thing sitting up on a box here. She got me this as well. Like I said, I'm a real big fan. I haven't put it together yet, but it's
Oh,
my little
great.
Peanuts puzzle and stuff like that. So I love just the fact that whenever you would hear an adult talk, because this is exactly what I hear as a kid, want. Whenever an adult would talk, that's what I hear. And the fact that it seemed like it was the first cartoon I saw that was meant for kids, or it didn't talk down to kids, or it didn't make you feel like, oh man, like what did they mean when they said that? It felt
Hmm.
different, and it felt like it was a kid. Felt like it was for a kid. And
Hmm.
it's such a great thing. And one thing that I really like hearing is, like, you don't want to feel old. That was the worst thing. Or you don't want to feel like an adult. You don't want to feel like you're older than you actually are. That was the dumbest thing I wished when I was younger. I can't wait to be an adult. Let me tell you, boys and girls, if you're younger than 18, cherish the last moments of your life, because when you hit 18, this is what happens. You have to start paying bills. You have to start getting a job. You have to do this, that, and the other. And most people, like my brother and my little sister, they're still living off my mom. They'll hate me for saying that. I mean, my brother's moved out now. My little sister for sure is taking it for granted. She's in her 20s at this point. But be a kid as long as you possibly can. And watching cartoons really helps that. Um, Now, when you were talking about a lot of the things you were saying, you mentioned something I never thought about to ask it. So obviously, East Coast and West Coast, very different when it comes to culture. I've been stationed over on the West Coast and I've been stationed on the East Coast. I'm an East Coast guy my entire life. However, where I live at is the Wild Wild West. We're in Florida, so there's nothing conventional about this state. This state, anytime you hear Florida, you instantly think of a dude riding a gator that was given the raccoon meth. Those are generally the first couple things you think about when you think of Florida. And I never thought to ask this, and I should have asked Jerry, but since you're here and you're just as much of an expert when it comes to animation as Jerry, at least in my eyes, when you think styles, everybody's got their style of food. You got East Coast pizza, you got West Coast pizza. Was there a distinct style as far as animation goes when it comes to East Coast and West Coast studios?
Well, yes, there, especially in the early days of animation, animation started, American animation really started more in New York than LA. The animation emerged out of the sort of the intersection of newspaper comic strips and vaudeville and minstrelsy, and the invention of the the camera where you could do one frame at a time.
Yeah.
So all of those things kind of happened they sort of converged to create animation as as we know it. And so that was happening more in New York. That was, like where comic strips were made and everything. So you had, all the draftsmen like Winsor McKay just sitting there in New York, doing their comic strips and doing their animation. And so the style that came out of New York, I tend to think, of it more as like the weird sort of, that combination of the Fleischer style and the Van Buren style, all of those weird things, like if you think of the, like any cartoon where you saw like everything was animated, the buildings were bobbing up and down to the music. To me, that's a very New York thing. There were no buildings like that in LA, so no one was drawing those in LA. That was a very, very much a New York thing. In LA, when people started going out there and doing cartoons, was it was much more of like a like farm jokes and animal jokes and things like that. But you had things like Betty Boop coming out of New York, so it was much more urban, much grittier, much more ethnic, much more sort of weird, a lot weirder. And in LA, there were farm jokes. And Jerry could probably put a finer point on all of that, but that's my observation, is that what came out of New York was a lot stranger and a lot more sort of urban, and just represented a different kind of world. And things were a little lighter and sillier with what came out in LA. And a lot more, Disney started doing the first really personality driven cartoons, so that's something that started up there. But yeah, there definitely was a difference in tone from the two places. And there's always been much more of an animation industry in LA. In New York, I would say there's not really an animation industry at this point. It's more like there are places that do some animation. You can get jobs in animation, but there's not, as far as the industry goes, the industry is in other places, but it's not really in New York anymore, which is unfortunate, because there have been points where there's been a lot going on in New York, and not as much now. People, it's more, I used to think of it as being more like advertising oriented, but there's really not much going on for animation and advertising at the moment. So I'd say, it's more just there's small studios and there's some network run studios and things like that, but it's not a big scene anymore. But yeah, back, in the 20s and 30s, it was really just all of that weirdness coming together, like people figuring out, what can we do with this? What can we use animation for? Well, you can use it to bring things to life that aren't alive. And so, that's hence the singing buildings and such, and dancing buildings, all that sort of thing.
Now, since you've been watching animation, and you said at such a young age, like 8, I think it was 8, right? Was it 6 or 8?
Yeah, well, I started, according to my mother, I started, like, in my baby book, it says age 3, loves to watch cartoons. So I think, as far as I know, when they let me watch TV, I watched cartoons and loved them. So yeah, that's pretty much when I started. I was a little kid when I was watching cartoons, and just continued to watch them. So yeah, but it was around age 8 where I started noticing that, people stopped watching kids shows, started watching, like, serious stuff, like the Brady Bunch.
It all, oh, that's such a horrible show. I can't, every time there's a few shows, like, I always wanted to watch stuff, with the exception of, like, I'm a huge wrestling fan even today.
Mhm,
It's the male version of a soap opera. I'm told that
mhm.
on a consistent basis. However, I look at entertainment a lot differently than most people. I don't ever sit here and say something is good or bad or indifferent, because I'm not in that industry, right? I don't feel like, as a consumer, it's either made for me or it's not made for me. And I
Mhm.
at a younger age, I think I struggled with that, because I'm like, oh man, they keep cranking out new Ninja Turtle. We'll just use that for an example, because it's the easiest for me to really compare and contrast a lot of things with. Um, at a certain age, I don't know if you were ever watching any of the stuff that the Ninja Turtles were doing, but they had one called The Next Generation, which it was right after the 90s movies. And this is where they introduced a female turtle, the fifth turtle, Venus. And the costumes were horrendous. They tried to capture what they had with the Jim Henson products, or with the production company. And then
Mhm.
after Jim died, after the second one, they didn't renew it for the third one. They went with, I don't even want to think about the name of the company they used for the third movie. But it was just horrible quality and everything like that. But once the new generation hit for the Turtles, I want to say 97, 98. So I'm 8 or 9 at that point in time.
Mhm.
And kind of like you, when you started looking at animation, as more of like, you were looking at more than just a fan. You were looking at it like, I need to know this, I need to know that. Like, why did they run by the same tree 3 times? Was this
Right.
guy lazy?
Yeah.
Was he drunk? What was he
Mhm.
doing? So I started looking at things in this aspect, where it's like,
Mhm.
I don't have to like everything, right? Whether I'm diehard Turtle fan, or I'm a diehard, let's just come up with the first one, Dexter's Lab fan. If they have so many iterations of any of these things, there's one that's obviously going to be for me. And it's generally the first one you see, or the one you
Mhm.
grow up with, when you hit that initial stage where you just start looking at things differently. And then anything after that, it's not subpar, because that's an incorrect term, and I guess it's a mean term, but it doesn't live up to the hype of the first one you saw, or whatever hooked you in the first place.
Right.
And that's
Right.
where I started looking at things where it's like, it's not good, it's not bad, it doesn't suck, it's not the greatest. It's just like, it's what's for me, right?
Mhm.
And when I look at things like this, I can't sit there and say this was a bad piece of animation, or this is a great piece of animation. I look at it in this sense. I go and look at it like, oh man, this is great. This speaks to me. This is made for somebody else, right? So I can
Mhm.
have fun with this one, even though there's the second one out here. It's new, and it's getting so much hate, or it's getting so much love. I still have what means the most to me here that I can watch, right? And I wish more people would look at everything like that: entertainment, music, all of it. So I'll never go out and say anything sucked. However, you brought up a name that I have had. I don't understand the cult following to this show. And when you say John K, I'm assuming you mean the creator of Ren and Stimpy, correct?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
I'm just going to come off and say it. Just I'm a sailor, so I like little words, right? So we're gonna leave it at that. This guy is a douchebag. I have heard nothing but horrible stories about this guy. I've never understood the fascination with Ren and Stimpy. I've tried getting through it, with the exception of Billy West and a few other voice actors that I've heard that are on there, with Cheryl Chase, the voice of Angelica. I have heard no good stories about this man, and I'm just pretty much going to leave it at that, because I don't want to get anybody in trouble. I don't want this guy's obviously never going to be on my podcast, because I just don't like the show. Other than the voice actors and a lot of the artists on there, no intention of bringing him on. But I've never understood the mindset you would say, like, oh, women don't know funny, or they have to do this, so if they just leave me alone, we'll just let him do we'll let the boys do their cartoons, since they know. I love the fact that you're like, no, I'm going to be a part of this. I know what I need to do. You have your job, I have my job, and I have to keep you on track. And one thing that came up so often, the only reason I brought that up is because you said that they alluded to the fact that you just don't know funny, so they would assume they would just let you do whatever they wanted to do. One show in particular, you did let them do whatever they wanted to do, and I'm so glad you did it. And the reason your name came up, like I said, I talked about it in the beginning of the show, your name came up so many times when I talked. I only intended to do 4 episodes for Ed, Ed, and Eddy, right? I talked to Mike, I talked to Matt Hill, which was the voice of Ed. I talked to Jono, and I had on, I think, Big Jim. So that was essentially all I was going to do. However, Mike Kubat, which is a fantastic human being, he told me, hey, man, you should talk to this person and this person and this person. If you have any issues, I'll help you connect. I'll help bridge the gap, right? Which I'm ever grateful for Mike. He's such a fantastic, him and Jono, they talked to me more than any person should have talked to somebody that was a fan, because I'm sitting out nerding out in front of these guys. I couldn't have a coherent conversation with them to begin with. So I had to sit there and breathe.
Yeah.
Right? So when they told me that, like I said, your name came up more in that show than any other show. There was a few of them. I had, I'm gonna butcher his last name, but it's Carlos. He played Rocko in Rocko.
Oh, Alice Rocky. Yeah.
Thank you. I hate saying people's last names that I can't pronounce, because I always hate when somebody says my name wrong. And I've got an easy name. I get called Justin all the time, or Jeremy. There's no letters in there that match or rhyme with my name. So I always take offense when I say somebody's name wrong. But nonetheless, man, you came up so many times. And the one thing they always said was Linda was fantastic, and here's why. She let Danny be Danny. Obviously, she had to reel him in sometimes, as most people do with a lot of people. However, I've never seen a show quite like Ed, Ed, and Eddy. And I've never seen somebody, and maybe I just haven't seen a lot of animation at this point, but I've never seen somebody that literally got handed the keys to the kingdom that said, make a show, make it yours, say everything you have to say. And by the end of that show, when you watch it from start to finish, which I've just started rewatching again since it hit HBO Max not too long ago, they essentially got to say everything they wanted to say and then some. It was one of the craziest shows I have ever seen in my life. And like I mentioned with, Pepe Le Pew and Daffy and Bugs, you could take somebody from each one of those characters and you could point to them. I grew up on a cul-de-sac for a few years. So I had somebody that was like a Rolf. I had somebody that was like a Jimmy and an Ed and all these other people. And to sit here and see, and you brought up earlier, diversity and representation, all this other stuff, to see such a diverse cast on TV was so far ahead of its time. And I'm hoping one day I'll be able to actually get Danny on here to talk to him. But I'm hoping that show in particular would be, I guess, highlighted more, because you need creators that have that kind of freedom. And the reason I bring the connections with Danny and you up is because I want to know everything. And I feel like we're going to skip over so much of your career. But to sit here and really talk about your career, I need like 18 of Jerry Beck's and Leonard Maltin's books just to talk about the early years of Miss Linda Simensky. So it's going to feel like we're going to jump around, but I promise you, if you're up for it, down the road, we'll get you back on. And like I said, we could do 15 parts just on you, and it's just Nickelodeon years at this point. But I only got you for a little bit of time, so there's a few key points that I for sure wanted to hit. How did you meet Danny Antonucci and get involved with the Ed Boys as they're known today?
Okay, so well, I'm happy to talk about whatever you're interested in. So we don't have to cover my whole career. It would take a long time because I'm pretty old. But so I will focus on Danny because I remember all of this pretty vividly. So Danny had a film, Lupo the Butcher, that ran in one of the traveling shows of animation shorts. Mm-hmm. And so I had seen it, and like, it was pretty silly. It was a little intense, but I wasn't looking at it for that. I was just mostly looking at it because it was just such an odd short in the midst of all of these rather, serious shorts. It was just but I really liked the design of it. I thought the design was fun, and I over time I started hearing more stories about, Danny, just that this was based on his uncle, and he's a really funny guy, and I really wanted to meet him. So we finally got to meet. I was out in was it? Yeah, I was out in Vancouver, I think, and I had requested specifically if I could meet him and a couple of the guys from International Rocket Ship,
Mhm.
and so they met with me, and we all went out to dinner, and that was a lot of fun. And we didn't end up I didn't end up working with any of them at Nick. I was still working at Nick at that point, but then I got to know Danny because he was doing the Brothers Grunt for
Yeah.
MTV, and I can remember, like, every now and then he'd be in New York, and I'd see him in the office, and we had sort of a cordial. We didn't know each other super well, but we had a cordial relationship. And I remember, like, having dinner with him one time with Abby Turcouli from MTV and a few other people, and that was fun. And so I just was getting to know him. And then I went off to Cartoon Network, and he called me at one point, and he said, I had an idea for a show, and I'm going to fax it to you. And it was just a fax, and it just said, Eddy and Eddy, they're friends because they have the same first name. And I remember laughing and thinking about how I was friends with two people named Linda.
Mhm.
And I remember thinking, we're friends because we're named Linda. And that's pretty much the story here. And so when I saw this, I was just like, oh, that is so funny. And then, he sent me more stuff about it. And, like, all the characters seemed funny.
Mhm.
And it was like, okay, here's a guy who knows childhood.
Yeah.
He knows it, and he's really captured it, just all the little things, the kid who eats the weird foods, and the mean kid, and the popular girl who's actually very nice, and the annoying little sister. It's like, and the things about the Eds, it was just all there.
Mhm.
And everyone I showed it to at Cartoon Network, they were like, oh yeah, that looks cool. And so it was, it seemed like, I mean, at that point, Cartoon Network hadn't picked up anything that wasn't coming in through Hanna-Barbera.
Mhm.
But I showed it to my boss, and he said, yeah, let's do it. And so we started working with Danny, and there was a little bit of a funny story. I think he would tell it if asked, but I'll tell it first. So at one point, we were working. I think we were, like, talking to his lawyer already, and they mentioned that Nickelodeon was also bidding on it.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my God, this could go to Nick. And I had just left Nick, so they couldn't have it. I wanted it. And I called up Danny, and I started yelling at him. I was like, how could you? I want this show. This should be our show. We'll let you do everything you want. It's going to be more fun if you make it and I was like yelling at him. And I remember I stood up at my desk so that I could yell louder. It was like I was, it wasn't mean yelling. It was like begging yelling, but I was yelling at him. And after that, he decided to go with us because I called him up and I yelled at him, and he responded to that. And, I thought that was funny, but he said, it's because I could tell you really wanted the show. And so then he went with us, and we were there was a little more freedom at Cartoon than at Nick. That is certain. And so my goal was really just with each person, it was to understand, what were they trying to do? What is the show that they wanted to make? And then to make sure that that's the show they made, just to help them with that. So, like, kind of be a first audience and look at everything, and just make sure they were making the show they said they were going to make. And, part of my job was standards. Part of my job was, making sure it worked for kids. But I don't remember any of that being a real problem with Ed, Ed and Eddy. I mean, I'm sure there were occasionally standards issues. But I don't have vivid memories of anything ever being really problematic. I think occasionally there would be a joke where it would be like, oh, that's not even really innuendo. That's pretty direct, and we just say, oh, I don't think you can say that, and he'd be like, okay. And like, I don't ever remember anything being that much of a problem. I I do remember Danny spending so much time on each episode.
Yeah.
Like he was a real sort of a perfectionist. He had a vision for this, and he worked really hard to achieve that, which we all thought was actually good. And I always used to joke around about all the shows and say, I don't think they give prizes for best on time schedule. I think it really all comes down to, will they stand the test of time? And if they need a little extra time to do that, we can do that. And so I was a terrible producer in that respect, in that I always wanted to give people the extra time that they needed. But I wasn't a producer. I mainly worked on the development side, the development and the current series side, where I could just help people see their visions through. And so that's how I saw it. I was like, I was a person who basically was in a position like a book editor.
Mhm.
My job was to do the best possible version of this person's idea. I was helping them to do it by just basically, looking out for them back at the network and explaining the goals of the network to the people at the show. And that's how I saw it. And, I know that there were people who worked on Ed, Ed and Eddy who probably, were trying to keep him on schedule and were probably a little bit stressed out, but that wasn't exactly my job. So I didn't get too rattled about that. And Danny's just a really great guy. He has a huge heart. He has a crazy sense of humor, and a very distinct drawing style. But I think what made the cartoon work so well was the amount of heart that went into
Yes.
it. And if you go like underneath the unusual style and underneath the crazy animation and underneath all the weirdness, there really is a heart there. And an insight. Here's a guy that's able to corral all these people to tell these stories about childhood.
Mhm.
And about what it's like to be a kid and what it's like to deal with people that you're stuck hanging out with because you all live near each other.
Yeah.
And I always thought that was kind of a funny topic anyway, because I certainly had to hang out with people that I didn't want to hang out with, either because we lived on the same street or our parents were friends or we were related. But it's like your whole childhood is you hanging out with people that maybe aren't the best for you. Geography has decided that you're going to hang out with them. And he captures that feeling of difficult people that you're stuck hanging out with really well. So I always thought pretty magical. So yeah, I don't I don't remember stressing over much with the show. I mean, there were probably lots of little things, but I don't remember finding it to be a really hard show. And I don't remember them trying to, put a lot of things in to get away with it. It's like, there were a lot of other shows I worked on where people were always sneaking things in. But I think the people who were really trying to make a good show, they didn't get too caught up in that. And if they did want to do something, they were clever about it. They weren't creepy about it. They were clever. I mean, I know Powerpuff Girls occasionally would have a little joke, or Dexter maybe, a little joke in there that people in later years would say, "Did you know?" And it's like, yeah, but we figured, we weren't super worried. In fact, there were times where I was trying to get away with things too. There was a Dexter's Lab cartoon, Rude Removal, and I remember getting called down to the president of Cartoon Network's office, and the head of standards was sitting there, and they were both looking at me, and I was trying to make a case for why Rude Removal was fine, and they were like, "Would you like to have attend a series of focus groups with parents
Jesus Christ.
to learn more about why this wouldn't really be a good cartoon?" And I was like, no, I wouldn't. I'll go pull it. But it ended up, I think we did run it in the end anyway. I think we just ran it, like I don't remember, but I think we found some way to get it on without to get it on the air without, I think we must have bleeped out a lot of things in it, but I remember getting in a little bit of trouble for that. But I didn't care, at Cartoon Network, there was a little bit of credibility for getting in trouble. So, I was like, no problem. But, I always felt like, I was there to defend the people making the cartoons, and I was happy to do that. And, there were only a couple of times where I felt people pushed it so much that I was just mad at them. And, occasionally we'd have to pull something. But, we never had that problem with Ed, and Eddy that I can think of. It was solid. So I think that, if people are having fun making the shows, it comes through. So I really just wanted them all to be having fun. Now, I know that Danny was tough on the board artists because he always pushed them to do better work. And, I don't think everyone was used to that. I don't think they were used to the pressure of, yeah, you can make that funnier, or that could be better, or that sort of thing. So you're smiling, so you probably heard some stories about that.
I've had some stories on here that I've had to cut out of episodes completely because in cancel culture, I mean, I'll tell them to you offline if you want to. There's a few stories here that I've had to completely cut out, and I've never had more fun. Like, you always hear that quote, that adage, whatever you call it, don't meet your heroes, right? Because you always have an expectation of somebody, and very rarely do people meet your expectation in a good way, right? With that show, everybody I've talked to, I've got a few more people coming on. I'm probably going to butcher his name too, Patrick Carrad, the composer for that one. I've got him coming on.
Oh yeah, great.
And Rachel Lockhart or Lockett, I think it's Lockett. She was one of the writers as well for a couple of the later seasons. And everybody has the same the same concept or the same comments, that without that show, without Danny pushing them the way he pushed them. And you hit on it perfectly, because everything I've heard from him, I heard about Danny, is that he's a perfectionist, that he wants nothing less than perfect, because you very rarely do you get a chance to say what you want to say, or what you need to say, or really describe what you're feeling. And very rarely, if you ever get that, do you have an audience to say it to. And as an artist or anybody in a creative endeavor, there's nothing worse than having something you want to say and having nobody to say it to. It is crippling when you're in a creative field. And I feel, just as a fan on the outside looking in, from everything I've heard, to I'm sure you've heard posted notes that Danny would write. It looked like one of my favorite ones was Big Jim. He said that one of the post notes he had was, it looks like you drew this with your ass. Another one would be find a new profession. But one that I really wanted to hit on, and you mentioned as well, is where's the heart, or where's the soul in this, right? And watching this cartoon, from the beginning of the cartoon to the end of the cartoon, I was hooked, right? And it all started with that theme song. And I've told this story a couple times, but however, I always like telling it to people, because it is one of, I want to say my proudest moments, but it is one of my fondest memories. I'll never forget this at all. So when I was very, very little, I saw an episode of Hey Arnold, right? And it was the Pigeon Man episode. And it was about the guy being a pigeon man. He's a homeless guy, and he's trying to find his way and all this other stuff. At the end of the episode, spoiler, it's been out for 30 years, ladies and gentlemen, so don't crucify me here, but he ends up flying away, and it's like this big Jesus type moment, right? Oh, I almost dropped over my orange soda. That would have been bad. But when I saw that episode, the very next day, or a couple weeks later, whatever it was, I saw a pigeon at my sister's house, right? And usually when you get close to a bird, they fly away. Well, this bird wasn't flying away when I got close. His wing was dragging. So I go and I tell my sister, and she's like, well, go try to pick him up and see what happens. So I'm 9-10 years old. I go up and pick up a pigeon, and he didn't fly away, right? So I have him in my hand. I'm like, hey, he's got a little band on his leg. And she's like, well, let's call the number. So we call the number, and this guy that lived like 15, 20 miles down the road lost this pigeon months ago, right? He figured the pigeon was dead. And he's like, I'll be right over. He comes over, and he trains pigeons they're carrier pigeons. So he would train pigeons to deliver messages and races and all this other stuff. And I had such a fascination with pigeons, and it all started with these guys right here from the Animaniacs. I wanted to be in the mafia when I was younger,
Oh, yeah.
and I loved the Goodfellas, which turned out to be the
Mhm.
Good Feathers. So I had this weird fascination with pigeons. And he was like, I'll give you a pigeon. You know, most people wouldn't even pick up a bird, let alone call the number that was on it. So I really appreciate it, because he's like, this is one of my favorite birds. And I looked at my mom and she's like, absolutely fucking not, quote unquote. We are not getting a pigeon. We don't have the space for it. They stink, they smell. I'm like, Mom, but this pigeon is cool, man. And she's like, you're not going to be that kid that wants a pigeon. And I was like, okay, I guess. And then a couple weeks go by, and then she's like, hey, you know what? You did a good thing. Let's get you a bird, right? I had a dog, but I always was fascinated with birds. So she took me to this place, and I got a cockatiel. And before I even picked out a cockatiel, because all these cockatiels were hand fed, so they were very, very docile. You could pick them up, you could play with them, you could love on them and everything. It was like a cat or a dog you could just love on, right? And before I even saw the bird that I was going to get, I heard him, right? I walk into the thing, and there's hundreds of birds all over the place, and I hear him. And I just happened to look over, and this bird, and I ended up naming him Nacho. I've always been a fat kid. Food has always fascinated me. That's why I'm in the profession I'm in, because I love food, right? So I named him Nacho because he had these really rosy orange cheeks that looked like nacho cheese from the gas station. So I named him Nacho. And he was hanging upside down like a bat and swinging back and forth, going, just learning to whistle, because he was still a baby, right? So I get this bird, and I was like, I want that one, Mom. And then my mom got me him. So I take him home, and he's the coolest bird in the world, man. He would get out of the cage, and we never clipped his wings because I love seeing him fly, right? I wanted to see him fly because I always wanted to fly when I was a kid. So I just see him fly around the room, right? And me and my younger brother shared a room. He did not like my brother at all. Every time he flew around the room, he would shit on my brother's bed.
Oh, no.
My brother hated it, right? So at the end of the night, you put a blanket over the bird because it simulates the sun going down, and it says, oh, I have to go to sleep now.
Right.
So all summer, or no, excuse me, all school year, whenever I would get up in the morning, I would always an early riser. I'd get up at 5:30, 6 o'clock. And the first thing that was generally on during that time frame for the Cartoon Network block was Ed, Ed, and Eddy, right? And I don't know if you remember the theme song, but right, so that's how it would start. And I would hear, as the weeks go by, Nacho learning this theme song. By the end of the school year, we start in August in Florida, and we end at about May or June, depending on if we have a bunch of hurricanes that extend the school year because you can't go to school when the power's out. Right? He learned that entire Ed, Ed, and Eddy theme song within a school year, right?
That's great.
I was such a fan of that show until this bird started singing it during summertime, rain or shine. It was like the Pavlov's dog, the experiment. Every time he heard a whistle, his mouth would drool, he'd give him a treat and all that other stuff, right? It was the same concept. Every morning at 6 o'clock, this bird Nacho would wake up in the morning, and I would wake up to the Ed, Ed, and Eddy theme song every single morning. So
That's great.
That was one attachment I've had with the show. And every time I've told that story to the guys, they think it's great, man.
Yeah.
So this show specifically, right? What you said, it encapsulated what a kid is, right? That boiling line that was animated around. I never thought to ask that, and it just came up randomly. And Jono was talking about, Danny had this idea that kids have this energy, right? They're always moving, even when they're not. And I never thought about it. And I started watching. I'm like, holy shit, that makes perfect sense. All these kids have this pent up energy, and it's always moving. And the boiling line was just one other thing. And then not to mention all the colors with the crazy colored tongues because of the jawbreakers and all this other crazy stuff and all these hijinks they would get into. This show is just so phenomenal. It will stand the test of time. In my opinion, this was the greatest show Cartoon Network did during that era, right? And once this show ended around 2008, 2009 is when I joined the military, and I pretty much gave up animation. I noticed what we talked about earlier. There just wasn't a lot of stuff that was made for me. There wasn't a lot of stuff that was made for, a 6'2" redheaded dude from Florida. It just didn't seem like it was my animation, but I still have the animation that I grew up on that I could be a fan of, right? And then it wasn't till a few years later when I saw a show, and I don't know if you watch, too much cartoons. You're a busy lady is essentially what I'm getting at, Miss Linda. I mean, how you have time to talk to me, let alone do your job and keep everybody on task, is fucking baffling when I sit here and think about the hours. Not only you do that, you're a professor as well. And there's only 24 hours in the day. I want to know the secret, Linda. How do you get this done? But we'll get to that in just a second. You know, a show that got me back into animation was a show called Regular Show. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
Oh yeah, yeah.
There is just something that is so beautiful about that show. And I draw parallels to that show and Ed and Eddy, and here's why. They got to do probably not as long as a run as the Ed Boys got to do with Danny Antonucci and all the cast and crew there. But I feel like those two shows were the last two shows, at least for me, that I've seen. And there's so many shows out there now that I have not seen that I could probably correlate the same differences and or contrast them. But when I look at these two shows, they were given the artistic freedom. They were given the creative freedom to sit there and say everything they wanted to say. And by the time those shows were done, it felt like they got to say and do everything they wanted to say. And a lot of that comes back to you. And I know you didn't work on the Regular Show, you worked on Ed and Eddy and so many other shows, but a lot of that comes to your leadership and the way you did things. And you gave these guys a voice, maybe when they wouldn't have had a voice with Nickelodeon or Disney or any of these other folks. And as we wind down towards the end of this episode, the main thing I want to get through during this episode, to you especially, is as I've gotten older, I didn't realize what a thank you could really do to somebody until you're in a really shitty position or a really shitty situation, and somebody says thank you for something just inconspicuous, just something stupid, you know, oh man, thanks for taking out the trash or something like that. I didn't understand how grateful and how great it felt to be grateful. And really what I'm getting at is a long-winded way of saying thank you, Linda. I mean, without shows like this, without shows like Rocko and Samurai Jack and Dinosaur Train and Powerpuff Girls and Dexter's Lab and working with all of these creators, yes, you didn't create these shows, you didn't draw these shows, you didn't write these shows, but you had such a huge role in these shows, letting these creators be what they needed to be and what they needed to do and what they needed to say and what they meant to say, right? And if anybody takes anything from this conversation that we're having, is to be more like Linda. Let creators do what they need to do, because in today's day and age where people are getting canceled and things are getting canceled, and some things need to be canceled as far as just that mindset we were talking about. I'm going to treat him like Lord Voldemort. If you're a Harry Potter fan, he who must not be named, and we talked about him earlier, you know, he rhymes with Ron K or Ron L, whatever you want to call him. You know, there's things that do need to be canceled, him specifically. But there are things that I feel like we'll never get the same creative freedom that you fought for, specifically just talking about the Ed Boys. You fought for specifically, and you said rude removal. I got that one written down. I'm gonna watch that as soon as we get down here because I want to see if I can.
Dexter's Lab.
Yeah. So I got that one written down here. I'm gonna check that one out. I love that HBO Max put all this stuff back on TV. But without you, and I don't know how humble you are of a person because I just met you. So, you know, I'm gonna toot your horn for you, man. Without you, we don't get the same shows that we got when I was growing up. I don't get the same fascination that I had with these shows without somebody like you in your position. Like I said, you let Danny be Danny. Obviously, a lot of his shows ran behind because he wanted perfection and he pushed it. And when you talk to those writers and those artists, they said the same thing. If it was not for Danny, because a lot of those guys were brand new to animation. It was their first job into animation. Big Jim said it. Joel said it. I think Corey Toomey said, I haven't had him on. He's coming on later. Scott Underwood was another one. It was his first gig into it. Same thing with Jono. You know, all of these guys, this was their first, right? And you don't see that in animation anymore. You don't see creators getting to do and say what they need to say. And, you know, hats off to you, man. My hats off to you. I clap for you, a standing ovation, whatever I can do.
Thank you. Thank you.
You know, it's a long-winded way, and it's always the weirdest part of the conversation because a lot of people don't like the adulation that I try to throw on somebody. And as a fan, I feel like, especially last year we lost so many people, especially one being Kobe Bryant. And there's another reason when we talked about the podcast that I didn't bring up because I want to bring up in this conversation. When he died, right? Died at 41 years old with his daughter. And when he died, he left behind a legacy. But I heard a song directly after this. It was a song called "Will" by Joyner Lucas, a rapper, and his idol was Will Smith. The guy he looked up to was Will Smith. He made so many moves that he thought Will Smith would make, because that was his role model. That was his influence, right? And that's what I want this podcast to be about. He had a line in there that said, give them a rose while they're still here. Now, you never know when your time's going to be to go. You got to check in and you got to check out date. You don't know when you're going to be born. You don't know when you're going to be dying, right? So like I said, this is always the weirdest part, because it's really weird giving people that you never met all of this adulation, all this credit, and all these applause. But I really feel like it's deserving, because so often we know the names Ed and Eddy. You might know Danny Antonucci. I did not know how big Linda Simensky was until I heard your name 7 times. And then I was like, well, if these people are saying this, she has to mean something. And me, like I said, very new to learn. I mean, I just got this book, a couple months ago, and I'm still reading The Mice of Magic. I'm still reading through it on a consistent basis, because it's so much information here. I'm trying to read. It looks like a serial killer is reading this book, because I've got Post-it notes everywhere. I've got highlighter marks and bookmarks and this and that and all this other stuff, just trying to retain it. When you sit back and you look at your career, and like I said, we only talked about a very, very small portion. There should be books written about you, Ms. Simensky. But when you sit back and say you've retired at this point, this is always the hypothetical question that I always like to end with. When you sit back in your rocking chair, and I'm only equating this to a Southern type of thing because I'm from the South and this is what we do. We sit in a rocking chair, we sip sweet tea, and we reminisce about the good old days. But when you sit back and you think about where you started at age 3, when your mom said your favorite thing to do was watch cartoons. And then at age 8, you were talking about, that's when the switch got flipped. And I started looking at it as more of an analytical way. And then you get into, college, and you start doing this for Nick and Warner Brothers, and you end up with Cartoon Network, and then you're with PBS, and now you're a professor, and you've got all of these huge accolades under, say that right? Accolades, that sounds better, under your belt. When you sit back and you think about everything you've accomplished, and everything that you want to accomplish, and everything that you will accomplish, what do you think is the most gratifying thing that you have ever done in this career? When you sit back and you rest on your laurels, you say, I did that. What's one of the first couple things that come to mind when you think about the career you've had?
Wow. Well, first of all, thank you for saying all that. I do appreciate it. And I still work, so I don't stop and think about a lot of this. I know that, I tend to think about it a lot as an executive. Like, I was one of the first development people of this current era of development people. There were many development people before me, but, not as many working sort of the way we all work now, where the development executive is kind of an activist on behalf of the creator, on behalf of the creative of the show. I think, I started doing that because I wanted to do the opposite of what everyone before me had done. It's like you read all these stories about people who, how tough the executives were. And I always thought, well, I'm just going to be on the side of the animators, because that seems like the winning approach. I don't want to be an executive. I want to just help the animators. And I think that I'm always happy that I could, that I was able to do that. And that, and I for every good decision I made, I probably made 7 bad ones, but, luckily most people have forgotten all those bad decisions, those have gone away. And so I'm pretty thankful for that as well. But I think, when I think back on, a lot of the things that I've done, I'm happy that I trusted myself when there were a lot of times where I didn't really have any real analytical information other than my gut telling me do that or don't do that. I really pushed for Powerpuff Girls to go to series after it had tested really badly, and it was it appeared to a lot of people like I was really stupid. It was really not a wise move. But I saw something in, not so much, I liked Powerpuff, but I saw something in Craig's boards that he was doing for Dexter that I thought were so funny. And I said to him, I said, if you if you can pull that level of funny into the Powerpuff Girls, I think that would work.
Mhm.
And he's like, no, it tested really badly. And I was like, so you'll fix it. And, I pushed that, and, and that impacted a lot of people, that decision, certainly Craig and, all the shows he's made since, but all the people who loved Powerpuff Girls, all the girls who didn't pay much attention to cartoons, but loved Powerpuff Girls. And, it's sort of like, it was I mean, I loved it as a cartoon, but I think it's also a great case study
Yeah.
in something that, like wasn't a guaranteed hit, but, I was able to convince Mike Lazo. And, I remember right up until it premiered, there were like the head of Cartoon Network was like, it's not that funny. And I remember saying, well, it's ironic and that's okay. And, I was just trying to, like sort of defend myself. But then, it just became this huge sort of, pop culture thing. And I felt really good about that. Like, okay, this was definitely worth fighting for because people really seem to like this. And that's really what I wanted to do. I wanted to make sure that there would be shows that people would like as much as I liked Bugs Bunny when I was growing up. And so it was really more about, the audience and the audience getting to see some cool stuff and the creators getting to really, make, like, I always looked for creators who really had a vision for what they wanted to do, because I really wanted them to be able to make those cartoons and to feel, respected and appreciated while they made them. So I'm glad I did that. Even the projects I did that didn't do that well, I feel like, they all made sense to me at the time. Maybe they didn't get made the way I expected them to turn out, but, they all made sense to me. So I've never really gone back and thought, oh, I never should have done that. I feel very lucky that I got to work in animation at the time that I got to work in animation, because I feel like I'm a builder when it comes to work. I like to build things, and I got to help build the current animation industry by just doing the things that just seemed like I didn't really have the training to know what to do, but I did what I thought would be fun or cool or interesting, and every time something worked, I'd be like, huh, that worked. And it's always felt like this sort of weird combination of luck and timing and being uniquely prepared for something I didn't know I was preparing for. Like those three things happened all at once. And I think if the timing had been different, I don't know if it would have been as interesting. If I had joined the industry after it was all like, like like now, if I got into the animation industry now, there's such a set way of doing things, and so many people who've been great successes, and that seems so stressful. I got into it at a point where, like, it wasn't like it wasn't a big deal yet, so it was more fun that way, and I got to help build things. And I'm still amazed that like people are still watching these shows. There was an article maybe about a month ago or so in the New York Times, and it was about Courage the Cowardly Dog.
I love that show.
And it was like, a reconsidering of Courage and why it was such a great show. And I emailed John as soon as I saw it, and I was like, wow, that's amazing. And we were just laughing about that, like, it's so cool. But so I've always felt that I was lucky that I could be doing what I love doing at the time I was doing it. And sometimes I've wished that like I knew more, or I was better at my job, but I've come to understand that you do your best work before you know too much. Like before like you don't say no, that won't work to yourself when you're just starting out, because you don't really know. You get more logical the more you do something. You get you get better at it, and you get better at knowing what works and what doesn't, and you don't make the same crazy decisions. So I've come to understand that, like, I I was lucky that I was doing the things I was doing at a time when I was still figuring it out or making it up, because it made it interesting. And I had bosses, but I'm not sure they knew exactly what they were doing either. We were just kind of figuring it out as we were doing it. Like, we were trying to do things differently. And when you do things differently, it means you're doing them differently from the way you've done them before. So you're just kind of doing it the way you think is right, but you don't really know. And so I look back at all that and I think, wow, that's so interesting that we all got to do that at a time when no one really knew anything. And we were just like Nick, they went out of their way to hire people who knew just enough to kind of know what they were doing, but not so much that they had old-fashioned ways of doing it. Mm-hmm. And so it's really interesting to think about all that. Now, I don't know if I answered your question at all, but those are just some random thoughts I'm having about, those early days, and, how interesting that time was. And I feel pretty thankful that I was also, working for people who were supportive, like Mike Lazo or Jerry Laybourne, people that pushed me, the way Danny pushed people. People pushed me too, and I feel like it's really hard to kind of look at all the things you've done and kind of pick out the things that like it's hard, partly because each show added something, even the ones where I totally screwed up. It made me better at my job at a later point. And but I think I'm really proud of all the shows that people still love, because it's I'm glad we didn't worry so much about schedules and budgets and things like that. In the end, you just want them to last. You want them to still be funny 20 years later. So it's really nice hearing that people do think that they're funny 15 years later, or whatever. And I don't know that these companies like Cartoon Network can ever be as casual and as free as they were back then. So again, it's a timing thing. So I feel like that was pretty lucky. I feel like all those animators who were sort of coming out of this era where they had to work on bad things and they had all this pent up energy, it was sort of great to like find people and kind of unlock the shackles and say, yeah, now make sure it looks like you're drawing, and make sure it feels like your vision, and to be able to say that to people, I think was pretty great. And and the thing I like now about teaching is that a lot of people are curious about what it was like back then, and how the history of animation, how things got to the points they got to. It's a very logical story. Yeah. Like you were talking about Bugs Bunny being for adults, and it's like it became for kids because it was cheap programming that the TV stations could get and run at times when kids were watching TV and no one else was. And it didn't cost a lot, so they could afford it. They were this new platform, and they couldn't afford much, but they could afford to buy, old theatricals and put them on and let kids watch them. And that's how cartoons in the US became, quote unquote, for kids, was, because of the invention of television. So, every bit of animation history makes perfect sense when you line them up and you look at them. And so this explosion of animation that happened in the 90s, it makes perfect sense that after, decades of animation being sort of like, left for dead, and all these people loving it so much and loving the old stuff so much, it just makes sense that it would all explode and keep exploding. I mean, there have been periods where, but I feel like, now you get a lot of creators who grew up on Ed, Ed and Eddy and Hey Arnold and, all sorts of things. And everyone's always got a question for me. I was talking to this guy the other day, and he said, "So, can you explain Angry Beavers to me? Like, what was that about anyway?" And so I get these questions, and I love getting questions like that, because it's like, oh yeah, I can explain exactly what that was about, and how the network kind of morphed it into just two brothers, and I said, in the pilot, they were kind of angry, they were kind of nuts, but it's just funny to get those questions. And so I feel like, if you are going to provide, the backdrop to people's, to their childhood, you better be able to explain yourself 20 years later when they've got questions about, what did this mean and what did that mean, So we're at that time now where people grew up with these cartoons, and they're thinking about them, and it's a big part of their youth, and they just have questions. And so I'm just happy I got to be part of people's childhoods. And I ended up doing preschool programming after my son turned 2 and started watching TV, and I started watching with him. And I had a really good sense of what he was interested in and what he liked. And I thought, they're not making any kind of shows that he likes, but I could do that. And that's kind of what led me to PBS. And so here's something funny about that, is that I would say, of the 3 jobs that I've had in TV making, I get the most creative freedom at PBS.
Really?
I don't think people would believe that, but
That's insane.
yeah, I feel like it at PBS, people are like, just so much more, like, they're so much more open-minded about what a show for kids needs to look like. At Cartoon Network, there was sort of there was a range, but you couldn't break out of it. And at Nick, there was a thing you were trying to achieve. And at PBS, it's a little more open-minded than that. And I think the hardest thing is getting people to push themselves out of the range of what it is. But it's a bunch of very open-minded, sort of, fun-loving people who really want to make great shows for little kids. So I always feel like, the training that I got at Nick and Cartoon, I can use that to make the preschool versions of those cartoons. And you've noticed I've worked with Craig Bartlett, and I've worked with Joe Murray, and I, it's like all of these people who've had kids and who think about what their kids liked, and can just, do it for them.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd say that's the biggest thing I'm proud of, is that, I could sort of help create the backdrop to people's lives, and that they remember it all these years later. I think that's awesome. So I don't pick favorites. I don't like to pick favorites, because each show has something to commend it. Each creator has something awesome that they do or did, and I feel lucky that I worked with all the people I got to work with, and so it really comes down to that. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but it was fun talking about all those things just now. So thank you for the kind words, and thank you for giving me the chance to sit on my rocking chair and think back to the olden days. I do feel like I've written some essays for academic books, but I do feel like I should write more down, because I feel like, as an animation historian, I'm always looking for things that people have written about the things they worked on. I always feel like those are the most interesting documents. The best text for understanding something is understanding what someone was thinking about as they worked on it. And then I thought, well, if I'm trying to get these out of everyone else, maybe I should do it too. So
100%. I want to, just 1 second. As soon as we're done with this, we'll pause, and I want to talk about that. I won't take too much of your time up after that, but I really want to hit it on that point, because you named off shows, and you're just talking about animators. You had Danny with Ed and Eddy. You had John with Courage. You had Craig with Powerpuff Girls, and he was doing a Dexter's Lab as well. You had Jendi, which was on Dexter's Lab.
Mhm.
You had Van,
Yeah.
which is on
Mhm.
Johnny Bravo. You talked about all of these shows, and I'm leaving a couple out there, and I apologize. There's so many more we could talk about, really. But that was really the renaissance of animation. And you had other characters, you had other creators. You had Seth MacFarlane. You had David Feiss on Cow and Chicken. Seth MacFarlane was on Cow and Chicken as well as so many other boarded.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So
Yeah.
many,
He worked on a bunch of things. Yeah.
yeah, it's wild to sit here and think about 20 years ago, right? Just a ballpark to 2001, before the world completely changed with 9/11. You go back 3-4 years from that, so let's take 25 years, really. You think about all of the shows that came out of that, and you look at all of those shows, right, you just take a capsulation of that time right there. You flash forward 25 years, every single one of those animators has made a show that almost everybody in America has seen, from Family Guy to American Dad to Cow and Chicken to Angry Beavers. You can just go off. It is a murderer's row of animators and creators. And you had such a huge part in that, letting creators be creators. And I don't know if people say this enough. And the comment you made before we started rolling about your friend, going into a group of people, it's a very small group of people that know you, right? Remember that conversation?
Oh yeah. Yeah. My roommate. Yeah.
Right. So think
Yeah.
about it this way. Well, that guy might have taken it as far as like, if me, I would have taken it as a slight. I'm like, man, I'll show you type of thing down
Oh,
the road.
I think he was kidding me.
Oh,
And
100%.
I just thought it was funny. But
100%. But
yeah.
you look at it like, now you've touched more lives just by doing what you do. And most people that I talk to on here, they go, like, what would you get, or how did you get on this job? It's like, oh, it was just a job, man. I was just trying to pay the bills, right? When I sit here and think about all of this stuff you touch, and all these lives that you've touched, and all these people you've touched, both directly, as I throw my pen, both directly and indirectly, right? It is fascinating that you are as humble as you are. I would be telling everybody, oh, not that I created these shows, but like, I had a part in this and this. I would not be able to shut my mouth up at this point. So 100%, I do believe, if you can find it in your time at this point, you need to write a book, man, because, and you can call it, you've said it a few times, the backdrop. What was it? As a backdrop of your life, or something like that. You could use that as a title or something along those lines. Like I said, as soon as we get off this call, I just want to talk about that just real quickly. But at the end of the day, man, you did answer my question. And when I get people on here, it's not for clickbait. If one person sees this, that's not myself. I don't want to say that that's all I'm really looking for, because at the end of the day, what I'm really looking for is to have people on that had such a huge impact on me that I can have real conversations with. This isn't for clickbait. This isn't me trying to get you to bury somebody or just shit all over somebody that was just, rude to you or anything like that. That's not what this is about. This is about highlighting the names that are at the end of these shows. The credits on all of these shows go by like this. You have a 20-minute to 22-minute, depending on how many commercials you have on there, of a show, and you've got 7 seconds worth of credits, right? You pause it and you've got 50 names on one credit score, right? So that's what this is about. This is about highlighting you guys. And I really appreciate all the stories you've shared with me. I really appreciate what you've done for these creators, because it's not just that you created a fan like myself and fans like everybody else. You gave these creators I don't want to say freedom, because you definitely had to rein some of these guys in, some of these girls in as well. You had to do your job, but you gave them a place where they could feel, I don't want to say safe space. You gave them a space.
Well, protected.
Yes.
I was trying to protect people from just, annoying network executives.
Yes.
It's like I never really worked with too many annoying executives, because, I didn't hire them. I was lucky to work with really great people. They all went on to, bigger jobs and, to run things, and they're all out there making cartoons now. So, it was about protecting people, and it was about giving them an environment where they could be creative and feel protected. And that's really what people need when they want to be creative. They need to know that, someone gets them, and someone wants them to be themselves. And so I always felt lucky that I got that job. I took it seriously, because I felt like, I could do that. That is what I will do. I will be there for people. And that, to this day, that's what I do. I will spend as much time as people want working on things with them, because I feel like, in the end, the results will be good. People don't spend enough time thinking, and they don't spend enough time just talking to people. And that's something I can offer people, is that understanding them, taking the time to understand them, and then helping them to get to the point where the show is the show they wanted to make. And I was mentioning to you earlier, I'm working with Sonia Manzano on a show. We started talking about this show back in 2012. So that's a pretty long time ago. It took us this long to get to the point where the show is going to premiere. And but we spent a lot of time talking, and a lot of time thinking, and a lot of time, going through things. And things need time if they're going to be good. They just need a lot of time. And so that's, I kind of feel like, what can I give people? Time. Yeah. I will give people time. And I think sometimes that's the thing people need. They need, they just need that level of being listened to. And I think I can do that. That's something I'm good at. I'm more than happy to do that. And so I think, and I feel lucky that I got to work with all these people. And again, it was, that combination of timing and luck, and preparing for a job that, didn't exist yet. But, it worked. And with good creators, you can just see it immediately. They have something about them. They have something they want to say, and they just have ideas, and you just feel this, like electric feeling from people. And I always feel like, those few times when I get to meet someone who's like that, I will work really hard to make sure they get a show, and that their show is great, and, and that they're happy. So, so it's great when it works, it's great. So I am, it means so much to me to hear that you like the show so much, that you've put so much of your time into talking to all these people who worked on it. I mean, that's so wild, because it's so great. It's, and it's like, you probably don't have the time either, but, it's so important to you that you are taking the time to build, to sort of build a repository of information about the show for, future researchers. So good for you, that's awesome. And it's great for the people who worked on the show too, because they're getting recognized for the awesome contributions, and all the crazy post-it notes that everyone had to deal with. But we loved those post-it notes, even the mean ones, they were funny.
I can only imagine. Like I said, as we start to wind down, and I didn't mean to keep you this long, but the time kind of flies by. This might be the longest podcast I've done so far. Usually,
you're gonna have to edit now.
Absolutely not. Everything is staying in here. Everything is going up, because there's one thing I don't like, unless you guys just say something you couldn't have said because you couldn't release that information just yet, or just something happens. I try not to edit. So people need to see this in long format. And that's what a conversation should be, man. A conversation is not just yes and no, everybody trying to get their shit in. I got this to say, I want to say this person says this. It doesn't really work, and it comes off very ingenuine. It doesn't come off like, oh man, this guy's just doing this to talk to people, he's just on to the next one. And no, like, I want to have everybody on that is on every credit of every show I've ever been a fan of. And
yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah,
that's great.
That is my ultimate goal, man. I told Jerry last night that my ultimate goal is to do what you're doing, and you've been doing for so long, Jerry, but I want to do it in a video format. I want to give people the credit that they deserve while they're still here. There's so many creators that are long and gone and in the ground and will never be able to talk to. Same thing with artists and writers and all this other stuff. And I feel like that's a travesty. I feel like that's something that, like I said, I told you earlier, it's something, just a thank you can do so much for people, especially what it does for me. These things gave me so much joy both when I was a kid and when I was deployed, when I was missing my wife and my son, when I was overseas fighting a war that we shouldn't have been fighting. And I'm not going to get on anything like that, but we shouldn't have been over there. This gave me solace. This gave me hope. This gave me a time where I could laugh when I didn't think I could laugh, or I didn't think I should laugh. It gave me
Yeah,
a
that's great.
time to decompress. And we all need that, especially now more than ever. With as divided as this country is, there's something that can bring everybody together. And I think that's animation. You saw it at such a young age, at 3, at 8, and all these other different ages. I saw it at a young age too. And that's something we can take from cartoons. Jerry said it's not made for kids, but now it is made for kids. We've got cartoons that are specifically made for kids. A lot of the shows you work on now at PBS, and I thought it was wild that was the most creatively freedom that you have right now. With all the shit I've seen on Cartoon Network, that PBS is the place to go now. But like I said, as we wind down here, I want to thank you again just one more time, because this was an enlightening conversation. I didn't know what to expect. I never know what to expect when I have anybody on, because when I have anybody on, I literally write your name. I write down some bullet points, because I don't like going by a script, because then it feels like I'm boxed in. It feels like I'm claustrophobic, and it just feels like, oh, he's reading from something. I like keeping it free flowing and organic. If I forget about a point I wanted to make, it'll come back to me later. I'll have you on 6 months, a year from now, whatever it is, and I'll hit it then if I want to. But I like this free flowing conversation. I like how deep you got into, people call it the weeds. I love stories like this, because this industry is so damn guarded when it comes to stuff, because everybody's afraid to say the wrong thing, or everybody's afraid to say something that might see them in a negative light or a positive light. It's very weird with stuff like this, but I get it, right? So when I have people on like yourself, or I have people on like Jerry or Fred Seibert or Billy West, insert any name that I've had on so far, it's always so fun and refreshing when I have people on that let their hair down, they talk, and they enjoy talking, man. So thank you for that. You should teach or something like that, Linda, because you're fantastic at talking. But as we end this, I always open this up for you, for the guests. Is there anything that you would like to say? You briefly touched on it. So Alma's Way is coming in a couple months, you said, right?
Yeah, that's Alma's Way premieres on in October 4th of this year. And it's created by Sonia Manzano, who was a Maria on Sesame Street. So if anyone was a fan of hers, it's coming. It looks super cool. There's a moment in the opening where it's sort of a bird's eye view, and you literally go, the subway train is going by, and you go through the train, and you see the people on the train, and it's all over in less than a second. And you've gone through this train to get through to the other side of the train, and it's such a great opening sequence. So watch it for that. It's like it's great animation. And Pipeline Studios up in Ontario did that, and looks super cool. And then the next show that I have that's coming up is Puppets. It's the Mr. Rogers spinoff, Don Quixote. I'm not as much of an expert on puppets, I have to say. Not my area of expertise, but it will be interesting to see if kids are into puppets these days. So I'll report back. But it's a funny show, and we're working with it's the team who does Nature Cat, another show on our air. They're also puppeteers, and they are making this show, and it's a lot of fun. And yeah, so those, and working on more shows after that. So if anyone out there is interested in developing shows, if you want to get more into the nuts and bolts of what it takes to make a show, you can track me down through Julian, and I will walk you through the process. So happy to do that.
I've got a name for you, and I'll send him along.
Oh, cool. Okay, good.
He's
good.
doing a few years after the Ed boys finished up there in their last year of high school. It's called Peach Creek. George Aberdeen, fantastic guy. Found him on YouTube of all places, and then
cool.
I've had him on the show. He's a fantastic person.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
I'll for sure I'll make sure he sees this video for sure. But is there anything that you have not said that you would like to say as we wrap this up?
Well, thank you. Thank you for doing this. And it's this is a public service, what you're doing, talking to people. So thank you. And it was, of course, it was fun to talk your ear off. You're probably like, oh my God. But, it's really a lot of fun to talk about cartoons. And my family has grown bored of me. So, it's my son's like, animation, it's okay. So, so this was fun. So something I don't get to do that much. So,
well, I'm glad, man.
thanks.
I'm always looking for a co-host, Linda. So if you can find time in your day, we can come back on. We can do this shit again. But nonetheless, man, she's been Linda. I've been Julian. This has been What's My Head podcast. And if I can say anything, meet your heroes, ladies and gentlemen. Bye-bye, and I'll see you guys later.
Bye.
This podcast was presented by the Epic Sewers Podcast Network, the home of all your pop culture podcast needs, with shows like Epic Tales from the Sewer, the Spoiler Force Podcast, CreatorCon Q&A, Comic Watchers, and the